Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're talking about the wolf effect on public land elk hunting and specifically how predators change where mature bulls bed, move, and survive. This is one of the questions I get asked the most. Now, before we get too deep into this episode isn't about politics or emotion. It's about behavior because whether people like it or not, wolves absolutely influence elk movement and their security patterns in certain areas. But the biggest mistake a lot of elk hunters make is blaming wolves for everything while continuing to hunt elk exactly the same way they did 20 years ago. If you're not adapting to wolf or human pressure, you're losing. But predator pressure, it does change how elk use terrain. It changes how they trust wind. It changes how long they stay exposed. It changes where mature bulls feel safe enough to bed during daylight. And if we all don't understand those changes, we end up hunting empty country that still looks perfect on a map. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years. And I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter. So in this episode, we're breaking down how predator pressure reshapes elk behavior and how smart elk hunters adapt to it. One of the biggest misconceptions in elk hunting around wolves is that wolves simply push elk out. Sometimes local elk numbers absolutely decline, but in a lot of public land country, the bigger shift is behavioral. Elk stop using terrain the same way they used to. Predator pressure creates constant uncertainty. Elk start prioritizing visibility, escape routes, wind advantage, and group awareness. Mature bulls especially become far less predictable because survival pressure rewards unpredictability. A bull that survives multiple predator encounters learns quickly that comfort gets him killed, easy bedding gets him killed, predictable movement gets him killed. That's why old historical bedding areas sometimes go cold in wolf country even though elk still live nearby. The elk haven't disappeared, they've just adjusted, and a lot of times better than we realize. You'll often notice elk traveling further from feed to bedding. They may side hill more. They may avoid open parks during daylight altogether. They might stage near escape terrain before fully committing into feeding areas. And once that elk hunting pressure stacks on top of predator pressure, those survival patterns become even stronger. This is where a lot of elk hunters fall behind. They just keep hunting where elk should be instead of where survival pressure now pushes them. This is where things get really important for hunters. In predator-heavy country, mature bulls often stop bedding in simple, obvious, dark timber pockets. Thick timber alone isn't enough anymore. They want terrain that gives them more escape options. That means bulls often start bedding closer to broken terrain like avalanche chutes, cliff bands, deadfall tangles, steep finger ridges, and benches connected to multiple drainages. Why? Because escape matters. And you'll notice this same thing in really heavily public pressured areas as well. A mature bull wants multiple exits. He wants to detect danger early. He wants wind advantage, and he wants terrain that slows predators, humans or wolves, down while quickly allowing him to disappear. A lot of hunters still think security equals the nastiest north slope timber they can find. But in wolf country, security often becomes layered terrain complexity instead. This is why you'll sometimes find bulls bedding surprisingly high or surprisingly exposed or surprisingly close to rough terrain a lot of hunters avoid because it's miserable to access. The key isn't simply finding cover anymore, it's finding the right cover that's connected to survival architecture. When I'm scouting maps in predator country, I'm looking for terrain transitions where a bull can monitor wind, escape downhill or uphill quickly, and disappear through broken terrain within seconds. That's a very different bedding system that a lot of hunters are looking for. Now, wind becomes absolutely critical in predator country because wolves hunt primarily with their nose and endurance. A mature bull that survives repeated predator encounters starts building his entire bedding strategy just around scent security sometimes, I think. Not convenience, not comfort, but strictly that survival by his nose. And that's why some of the best bedding areas in wolf country are places with complicated thermal movement, a lot of swirling winds that frustrate hunters, but they can actually help help elk because predators struggle to approach consistently without being detected. You're also going to notice bulls bedding in transition layers instead of just dead bottom creek timber. They want airflow, they want information coming through the wind. And interestingly, really calm timber pockets can actually become dangerous for elk because scent hangs and visibility drops. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. So this is something that a lot of elk hunters miss. They only think about whether the wind is good for them, but mature elk are thinking about whether the terrain provides enough scent information for them to survive well daily. That changes how you should scout. Instead of asking, where would I like to bed? Ask, where could a mature bull survive repeated predator pressure using wind, thermals, and terrain together to his advantage? That question changes everything because predator pressure also changes how elk move through the landscape. In a lot of wolf-heavy areas, elk compress their daylight movement into smaller windows. Bulls might feed later into darkness and return to bedding earlier in the morning. They're going to spend less unnecessary time exposed. Movement also becomes a lot more terrain-oriented. Instead of crossing giant open basins during shooting light, bulls often contour through the dark timber edges, side hill through broken cover, or move through small transition pockets that hide them better from both predators and hunters. This is why some hunters swear elk vanish after wolves move in. The elk are still probably traveling, they're just moving a bit differently. You'll also notice elk using terrain screens more aggressively. Small folds, brush lines, benches, timber fingers, and contour shadows all become movement highways. And this matters because hunters often arrive too late. If you're hiking into glassing points after daylight in predator country, there's a really good chance mature bulls are already repositioned into security terrain before you ever started glassing. That's why edge glassing becomes so important too. Sometimes the best observation isn't the giant open country. It's usually watching the transition layers between feed, movement, cover, and security terrain. That's often where the predator-aware bulls are going to briefly expose themselves before disappearing again. And this is the part a lot of hunters oversimplify. Wolves absolutely affect elk behavior, but wolves alone usually aren't the full story. Hunting pressure stacks on top of predator pressure, and together they create the extreme survival-oriented elk. I hear a lot of guys only complain about the wolves, but I believe it's a combination of wolves and hunters that together combine this newer elk, this newer problem of elk disappearing or elk not talking and elk being harder to figure out. Think about it from the bull's perspective. Predators pressure him year round. Then hunters arrive during archery season with calling, scent, movement, more trail pressure, camp pressure, side by side zooming around the roads, and constant human intrusion. So eventually mature bulls start shrinking their margin for error. That's why heavily pressured OTC bulls often live in tiny micro security zones that a lot of hunters walk right past. And honestly, that's where experience starts separating elk hunters. A lot of elk hunters keep chasing bugles randomly, if they can find them at all in elk country, hoping that aggression is going to solve the problem. But mature public land bulls usually prioritize security first. Security becomes a lot more important than feed. I've talked to a lot of guys on the phone about this recently. It doesn't mean that elk stop eating, but it absolutely means that they feed where survival still feels manageable. It's the security first, then they make the food work for them. And this is why terrain knowledge matters so much in modern elk hunting. The hunters consistently killing mature bulls in difficult public land units usually understand terrain security better than all the rest of the hunters. They're not hunting where elk look easiest to hunt. They're hunting where elk feel hardest to kill. They're not hunting where elk are easiest to hunt. They're hunting where elk feel hardest to kill. I wanted you to hear that again. So, how do we adapt to this? First, I think we need to stop relying completely on historical spots. Just because elk used an area heavily 10 years ago doesn't mean mature bulls still trust it today. You need to scout current security structure, focus on terrain complexity and escape access, thermal reliability, difficult access, and low human intrusion. The nastiest terrain often becomes more valuable because pressure naturally filters hunters out. Second, stop pushing so aggressively into core bedding areas too quickly. This is probably a good rule no matter what country you're in. Predator aware elk are extremely sensitive to intrusion, right? Sometimes the smarter play is hunting transition layers instead of diving directly into the security pocket. Third, be patient before making moves. Watch movement longer. Learn how elk are using terrain before forcing an aggressive setup. Predator adjusted bulls often expose themselves for seconds, not minutes. Calling strategy matters too. Blind calling constantly in heavily pressured wolf country can absolutely hurt you. Situation calling near terrain funnels, escape routes, and movement transitions usually becomes far more effective. And finally, stay adaptable. Rigid plans fall apart pretty quickly in predator country because elk movement becomes more fluid and security driven, like we've been talking about. The elk hunters who adjust fastest usually stay around elk the longest. Now let's clear something up, and this is probably going to ruffle some feathers, and that's okay. Wolves absolutely influence elk behavior. I can agree with everybody on that. Anybody spending serious time in certain Western units has seen the changes take place in movement, bedding, vocalization, and elk terrain use. But some elk hunters go too far and use wolves as their explanation for every difficult hunt and their lack of success. I think that that's reckless and it stops adaptation. Why can't you take more responsibility? Are you refusing to adapt to the situation? Then you're going to have a lot of empty freezers because the reality is mature bulls still survive in wolf country every single year. They still get killed every year too by good elk hunters, but they often become harder to locate because survival pressure forces them into more disciplined terrain use. And honestly, a lot of elk hunters simply haven't adapted yet. They're not as disciplined. They're still relying on old assumptions, old access routes, old calling habits, old bedding theories, wishing things were the way that they used to be. Those days are over. Meanwhile, the best elk hunters I know in predator country usually become quieter. They become more patient and they become more terrain focused. They stop forcing elk hunts and they start reading survival behavior. That's the real lesson here. The goal isn't complaining about changing conditions because we're stuck with that. The goal is understanding how changing conditions reshape elk behavior so we can adapt faster than the average hunter because the mountain doesn't care what elk used to do. It only rewards hunters who understand what elk are doing right now. At the end of the day, wolves don't just pressure elk physically either. They pressure them behaviorally. They reshape how mature bulls use terrain, trust wind, move through the landscape, and choose bedding security on public land. And once hunting pressure stacks on top of that, the bulls that survive multiple seasons become incredibly disciplined animals. And that's why so many hunters And that's why so many hunters struggle in country that still looks perfect on a map. They're hunting old assumptions instead of current survival behavior. The goal is no longer just finding elk habitat. The goal is understanding where a mature bull feels safest living every single day under that constant predator pressure. That changes how you scout. It also changes how you glass. It changes how you approach bedding. It changes how patient you need to become. And honestly, the hunters consistently killing mature bulls in predator country usually aren't the loudest hunters on the mountain. They're the hunters who understand how survival pressure changes elk behavior before they ever take a step into the basin. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. You can check out our Elk Camp at backboneunlimited.com. If you missed the 2026 version when you're viewing this, be sure to get in on 2027. It is going to be an ongoing, successful educational opportunity for all of my elk hunting loving friends out there. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. I look forward to seeing you in the comments. I read them all. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.